So welcome. I was just saying I'm in Edinburgh this afternoon and the sun is shining. So I'm hoping that wherever people are, the sun is shining for you too. Thanks very much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. Uh, this afternoon session, I see there's quite a few questions about ELC. So this afternoon session is really focused on residential childcare or not really suitable, particularly for ELC. So I don't want to make anybody feel unwelcome, but it won't be a session that I would imagine is particularly useful for you. So you might really appreciate dropping off the call and using the time. I know that everybody's incredibly busy and pressured all the time, so I'm sure you'll appreciate getting the time back. My name is Helen Happer. I'm one of 4 chief inspectors working here at the Care Inspectorate, and my area of responsibility are services for care experience, children and young people, school care accommodation, and a kind of range of other things. I work across both our strategic team, which undertakes inspection of social work services, and our joint inspection programme, and the regulatory team. This is a session that's really focused on our regulatory team, regulated services for children and young people, and particularly for residential care. So I was saying that this is really a session that's been set up for with a focus on residential childcare. We're really wanting to share with you our thinking and our approach going forward into the forthcoming year. Some of you may have had the opportunity to join us at a conversation that we had, a quality conversation in I think it was in Perth, if I remember correctly, before Christmas. So it was the back end of last year, when what we were doing really was trying to wrestle with some of the challenges that we know are around for people at the moment. We recognise that we're in a situation where expectations of what are good outcomes and good experiences for children and young people have never been higher. And that is rightly so. We don't make any apology for that. As a country, we really are aiming high. We also recognise that it's an extraordinarily challenging time for the sector, extraordinarily challenging. There's financial pressures, there are staffing pressures. It feels very difficult, I'm sure. And we understand that. I know that a lot of the time people think the inspectorate doesn't understand that. We do, we get it, we know. But we also have a responsibility to try to drive as hard as we can to achieve what we all do want to achieve, I'm sure, because that's why we are all in this business, is the best possible outcomes for children and young people. So I just wanted to start by acknowledging the pressure and to say we do know that, and we're ready to have conversations about that. And we have made some proposals going forward for our approach into this year in the light of that context, the context of that conversation. And a number of people will be talking to you about that during the afternoon, but Andy, I think in particular, is going to be talking a bit about that. If everybody has questions, I would encourage you to use the chat function. It's too big a meeting. We're not going to have the timing to be able to kind of stop, start and take lots of questions. But if there are things then that we're left with that don't get answered in the session, we will take responsibility for harvesting those questions and trying to come back to you with points against what you're asking. So we don't want anybody to leave anybody still kind of going scratching their head and saying, I don't get that. But some of your questions might get answered by different speakers as the time goes on. So just to outline what we're going to do this afternoon, we've got a number of people who are going to present information to you. We're going to start with Debbie Jones. Debbie is very welcome. She's an inspector from registration, and she's going to talk to you about registration and variations and about our approach, and hopefully answer some questions for you that you might have in your head around that. Then we're going to move on to Andy Sloan, who I'm sure will be well known to most, if not all of you. And Andy's going to lead us through the inspection methodology for the forthcoming year and the core assurances. And if that doesn't make sense to you, by the time that Andy's spoken to you. I'm sure it will. Then Alison, who will also be a well-kent face to you, Alison Jameson. Alison is going to talk to you about an inspection focus area that we're planning for this forthcoming year. And then Mary Morris. Mary, to give a wave. Mary is going to lead us into a discussion with one of our young inspection volunteers, Abbas, who we're really delighted is with us, and Lisa Fagan, who's an inspector in that team. And we're going to talk a bit about promise into practice and the involvement and participation of young people in our scrutiny work. And then Charlotte Wilson is going to round up our session and respond to any kind of questions from the chat. And if there are kind of themes that we'll say we'll have to come back to you on that, she'll try and pull those together, and we'll take responsibility for making sure that you get answers to those questions. So I'm looking forward to the afternoon. I'm going to stay with you for most of the afternoon. So thanks very much in advance for your attention and for listening. And Debbie, I'm going to hand over to you now, if that's okay.
So, yeah, I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm Debbie Jones, and I'm an inspector in the registration team. And I'm just going to briefly talk to you about the work we do and hopefully be able to give you some helpful advice and some information. Charlotte, are you okay to move this slide to the next one? Thank you. We have got 3 registration teams in the Care Inspectorate, and they're all national teams, therefore cover the whole of Scotland rather than any particular geographical area. 2 of the teams cover early learning and childcare services, and the other team covers adult and children and young people services. So myself and my colleague Mark Cosser cover the majority of the children and young people's work that comes in, and our team manager is Mary Owens. Our main responsibilities include giving pre-registration or pre-variation advice. We would encourage any new provider to get in touch with us at a really early stage if they're potentially going to provide a care service, particularly if it's premises based. If you submit an application for pre-registration advice, we'll meet up with you, we'll talk about the application, and we'll be able to carry out a site visit. And that we really encourage that because it can be really helpful before your application goes in. However, we also encourage and welcome requests for advice from existing providers if they're wanting to talk about a new service or changing their service in any way. And this can be done via the registration inquiries box, which I've put a link into the next wee bullet point for, or you get in touch with your case holding inspector or contact us directly. We also take turns at manning the registration inquiries box, which is really just a mailbox where if you've got any queries that you don't need an urgent response to, we'll get back to you within 2 or 3 days. And it can be really helpful, you know, if it's just something that you're thinking about or you just want to clarify. We also look at and deal with all new applications to register new care services, and I've put in there that can take 6 months or longer if required, but up to 6 months is what we say. We also deal with changes in legal entities, which this often requires a re-registration, but not always. So get in touch with us if your company's changed in legal entity, and we can discuss that with you. We also deal with all variations to the conditions of registration, and this process can take 3 months. Another thing we do that's probably not well known is that we look into any potentially illegally operating services. And the information about these services can come to us in a variety of ways. Things like a complaint being made about a service and then we discover we didn't know anything about the service, or it could come from the social work department querying whether a service should be registered, or it could even come from a member of the public. We're responsible for looking into it, and we could decide at the end that the service isn't registerable, or we could agree that it is registerable and the person puts in an application, or it could be that we have to actually report it, the service or the provider, to the PF because they're operating illegally. We also link with children and young people inspection teams because they might have registration queries, or we may have inspection queries with them, so we work very, very closely with them. We act as relationship manager to some of the larger providers, and we support inspections and complaints if appropriate. For example, we'll quite often go on the first inspection of a service that we've registered. Is it possible to get the next slide, Charlotte? Thank you. So this is just some rough figures. It's quite hard to determine what the exact figures are because services like support services for children and young people or adult placement services for continuing care purposes, it's not very easy to count them in with children and young people's services because they're considered under the adult statistics. However, it's very likely that we had about 40 new children and young people's services registered last year and 200 variations. So that was just for a bit of information. Can we have the next slide, please? We do recognise that this is really challenging times for a lot of providers just now, and there's a variety of reasons for this. The complexities around the young people's needs at the moment, there's some really complex young people being cared for at the moment, and this can have a huge impact on resources, the service itself, the other young people in the service, the staffing, etc. Also, the national transfer schemes putting a lot of pressure onto local authorities who are regularly having to assess and place unaccompanied asylum seeking children and young people at very, very short notice. We know there's a kind of lack of funding, a lack of resources just now. Continuing care also has an impact. Young people are staying in their care services for a lot longer, which we really, really like. It should be encouraged, but obviously this creates a lot of strain on resources because young people are not moving on, so therefore there's less placements. This is resulting in a lot of emergency placements, things like, or emergency situations, things like services being over their numbers or providers having to create a bespoke service for particular young people, or having difficulty matching or knowing somebody isn't appropriately matched to the service but they have got no other options. So what I would say is if you find yourself in any situation that you're unsure of or want to discuss, get in touch with us as soon as possible. We're always happy to help and we'll be as supportive as we can. We try and support innovation as long as we can do that within the law. So I would re-emphasise, just get in touch with us as soon as you can and we'll discuss it with you. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So it's unlawful for anyone to provide a care service that's deemed to be registerable without registering it. I've included a link at the end that gives all the definitions of our care services. When a provider applies to register a care service, the first part of the assessment is carried out by our business support colleagues, and it involves checking things like the fee is correct, that the relevant checks have been carried out on directors, and that all of the information that's been asked for has been supplied. At the end of that stage, it's then passed to one of the inspectors to assess. And we are responsible for assessing all of the information that's provided in the application. If we feel it's not adequate, we often need to send it back to be redone or just to update. There might be some information missing, etc. And this can all take a bit of time, can be a bit frustrating for the provider. If the service is premises based, then we'll carry out a site visit. And I would, if you haven't seen it already, I would suggest having a look at our design guide for care home services because it's got loads of information in it, and that's what we would be assessing the premises on. We're responsible for writing an assessment report, and the outcomes can basically be that registration is granted. Registration could be granted with specific conditions, which is more likely, or we could refuse or propose to refuse the registration. And if it is granted, we are then responsible for producing the certificate of registration. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So we're assessing the quality of the information that you provide, and our main responsibility is to be satisfied of the provider's capacity to provide a care service in line with our regulations. I've attached our regulations at the end for your information. We also need to be satisfied that the provider will be able to meet and comply with other relevant legislation. For example, the Equalities Act or the UNCRC or building standards, etc. We're responsible for exercising good regulatory principles and practice. Therefore, we'll take account of the Regulatory Reform Act and the Regulator Strategic Code. and they stipulate that we should be proportionate, consistent, accountable, transparent, and target the regulation to where it's required or needed. And all of our assessments will be promoting and taking account of the health and social care standards. And we would always consider the scrutiny assessment, the SAP, basically for any existing services, and the regulatory history for any existing services that the provider has. Then we will create the first SAP once the service is registered, and each service can have a rating of high, medium or low, and that then helps the planning and inspection teams to make decisions about what scrutiny action is required. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. If a service wishes to change any of their conditions of registration, including their address if it's a premises-based service, then they must apply for a variation. This is done via the portal, and I've attached a link to some guidance for the portal because I know it causes a bit of stress amongst services and providers. I've also attached a link that tells you what should be done via the portal and what is still being done via the eForms system. We ask for 3 months' notice from the date that you wish the variation to take effect. However, there's obviously times that this isn't possible, like if there's an emergency admission. So please make it really clear in your variation if it's an emergency and needs more urgent attention. Conditions of registration can only be changed through carrying out a variation or where the care inspector has taken enforcement actions. There's no other means to change any of the conditions of your registration. And unless the variation is very straightforward, for example, removing an expired condition or removing the staffing schedule, then we would always consult with the relevant case holding inspector for the service. Therefore, I would strongly encourage you to discuss any potential variations with your case holder in the first instance, because we'll always go to them, and it's good if they know about it, because they've had time to think about it. They know the service better, and they would have a view on it. So the last 2 slides are basically just links to various guidance and legislation. There's a few links to help with the guidance on the portal. There's a few links to the registration requirements and legislation, etc. And a lot of children and young people specific information. I'd strongly recommend that you go on the website, particularly to the sections titled Portal or Registrations or Children and Young People, because they're really, really relevant and get lots of helpful information on them. So I hope this has been helpful, and I will now pass you over to Andy Sloan, who's the team manager in the Children and Young People Inspection team. Thanks very much.
Cheers, Debbie. Thanks very much. Afternoon, and as Debbie said, I'm Andy Sloan. I'm team manager for CY Children and Young People's Team 1, and I'm going to take you through the inspection process for the coming year, and we'll probably divvy it up into 2 parts with a break halfway through, maybe around about the halfway mark, just so people can have a coffee stop and stretch their legs. Now, they say never to start a presentation with an apology, but I'm going to. This is really a belts and braces run through of the inspection process. So for managers who are old hands at this, much of it may be familiar. But we still reckon there's enough new insights to offer some real added value for everyone. So please stay with us. And I suppose I hope the first thing to do is actually clarify the aim of the session. Now, I know it says on the formal title of the slide, it's about helping folk get the most out of the inspection process, and we'll hopefully do that. Give some pointers, explanations, tips, etc. But I suppose there's also an equally important aim, and that's really to help you and your staff feel more comfortable and at ease when that doorbell rings, and that smiling inspector with their ID badge is standing on your doorstep. But what then? That leads to the questions of why is that also an aim of the session, to make people feel more comfortable and ease. Well, it's as Helen alluded to. Firstly, and most importantly, we genuinely appreciate the pressures that frontline managers and staff are facing every day, and especially so in the sector at the moment. Now, an inspection, by its very nature, is going to feel as if you're under the microscope and be anxiety provoking. So one of the aims of this session is to reduce as much as possible any air of mystery or uncertainties that there are to the inspection process. What we're hoping is that if managers and staff better understand the different stages of the inspection process and why certain things are done and when, it will help reduce the understandable anxiety that any form of inspection or examination places on people. Secondly, we also hope that with managers and staff being better informed about our inspection processes, the easier it will be for them to provide the evidence needed at inspection. And that again reduces the practical pressures that are present at inspection and means the inspection can be completed as smoothly as possible. And finally, I suppose the ultimate outcome will be that both of us, managers, services, providers, and the care inspectorate, we can both be equally assured that the assessment of the outcomes for children and young people in a service is accurate and nothing has been missed. And when I say nothing has been missed, by that I mean the positives and strengths that are present, as well as any areas for improvement. But despite the graphic, however, I mean, we all know that after hearing this presentation, an inspection will not miraculously turn into some form of Zen-like spiritual experience. But we do believe that reducing the uncertainties of the inspection process will help. So on to the actual presentation itself. And best place to start is probably just to briefly revisit some overarching points about our inspection methodology. And the good news about that is that it's not changing greatly from last year. Now, I know that's small consolation if you weren't inspected last year, but that stability is there for the coming inspecting year. So firstly, our inspection priorities will continue to be primarily informed by risk, although we also factor in service type and length of time since the last inspection into our planning. So we do factor in those two other aspects in addition to service risk as part of our inspection planning. Secondly, the newly revised Key Question 7 of the relevant quality frameworks will be used when inspecting care homes, residential schools, and secure accommodation services. So that was the one that was launched just in March. And in terms of this new Key Question 7, it's helpful to confirm, same as last year, inspectors will still always look at quality indicator 7.1 and will also look at quality indicator 7.2 in some services. And that will be dependent on the current evaluation grades of the service, any intelligence we hold about the service, and or risk factors that we might identify. In terms of the quality indicators that will be inspected, inspectors will let the manager know when they meet the manager at the start of their visit what quality indicators they will inspect against. So it will be very clear to you at the start of the inspection. It's maybe also useful to point out, though, that inspectors can make a decision to assess quality indicator 7.2 when the original plan was only to inspect against 7.1. Now, that's usually because of some issues, uncertainties that might only start to become evident during the fieldwork component of the inspection. Now, inspectors need the approval of a team manager to do this, and the moment that it's decided, they'll let you know, and they'll also let you know the reasons for that decision, so it's completely and utterly transparent. And finally, just because we've had lots of early learning and childcare people here, and just in case there's other folk here that are wondering what it's about. This session is for care homes and special residential schools and the providers and managers and staff of those services. But just to confirm that the choice and the number of quality framework, quality indicators assessed in fostering, adult placement, fostering, adoption, housing support, care at home, and support services will also continue to be based on risk as well, even though these services don't use a key question 7 methodology. So let's move on to the inspection process itself. And I apologise in advance for the groan-worthy and tenuous link to the image, but it is probably best we take this in bite-sized chunks, and I'm really glad that you're all on mute for that. So we'll break it up into the 3 key inspection stages. What happens before an inspection, what happens during the inspection fieldwork, the bit where the inspector is actually at your service, and finally post-inspection. And for each of these stages in the presentation, I'll describe what the inspector does during that stage, and then also what leaders and staff in the service can do to ensure each stage has as much added value as possible. And that will also include how to minimise the urgency of evidence gathering and reducing possible anxieties for everyone that's involved. And I suppose when I mention evidence gathering, it's probably helpful to keep quite a pretty important principle in mind here in terms of the overall inspection process. And that is that it's the responsibility of the service to supply the evidence to support evaluations. It's not the responsibility of the inspector to make sure that they are digging or asking or sampling or interviewing until they find that. It's the provider's responsibility to supply that evidence. And that is actually most important when it comes to a service's strengths. Make sure you highlight these to the inspector. We really want to hear about what's working well for young people and the positive inputs that staff and the leadership of the team are having. And we're desperate to see the evidence of those strengths. And I suppose the flip side of that is another reason for emphasising that overarching theme is that there can occasionally be a perception that an inspector only seems to focus on the deficits or negatives at an inspection. Now, often the reason for that is if the evidence isn't made available or accessible in the window that we have for fieldwork, at the very least, we have to make sure children and young people are safe. And therefore, any uncertainties in relation to the supply or quality of that evidence, especially that evidence that's related to safety, means we have to have a focus on that. So that just gives you, again, it's not because there's a deficit or negative focus, it's just because primarily, if there are quite a few uncertainties, then what we have to do is have a greater focus on the safety of children and young people and the risks to outcomes that they might experience. So let's turn to the first of these stages, pre-inspection. So what does the inspector do at this stage? Well, their major task is reviewing and assessing all the intelligence we hold on the service about to be inspected. Now, that includes a range of things. The annual return information that you've provided, any detail on complaints or enforcements and the outcomes of any complaints and enforcement action that there's been, previous inspection evaluations, so what were the grades at the last inspection, any previous areas for improvement or requirements that were made at the last inspection, and related to that, the services action plan from the previous inspection if relevant, and again looking at the robustness of that, the timescales for the completion of any areas for improvement and requirements. We'll also look at notifications, and that's those incidents, allegations of abuse, restraint, and allegations of misconduct being the primary ones that we will focus on at that pre-inspection stage. And we'll also, just in the interest of transparency, review what we call the notification summary tool. Now, to explain that, this tool gives, for somebody that's not very good at maths or arithmetic, this tool gives the inspector averages of the number of notifications we can expect for services of a similar type and size, okay? And what the inspector is looking for is whether the notifications are over or under that average for the service that they're about to inspect. Now, what that doesn't mean, though, is that higher than average notifications equates to, in inverted commas, bad, and that lower than average notifications or lower than average notifications is a good thing. Because it might mean, for example, that the service with lower than average notifications is not making the required notifications, and the quality assurance of incidents and allegations of abuse and restraint isn't sufficiently robust. Now you're saying, right, Andy, why are you explaining a rather abstract tool? I suppose because what it does is to reassure you that all of this intelligence gathering is not about prejudging what we are going to find and how we will evaluate. The reason for all of that pre-inspection planning and intelligence gathering is about making sure what we call our lines of inquiry are as clear as possible before inspection. And that's so we can minimise the amount of intrusion on the service and ensure the focus of our fieldwork is as targeted and proportionate as we can make it. It means inspectors can clarify the questions they might want to ask and what evidence they need to see first to make the scrutiny of the service as smooth as possible for those working in it. And in effect, it doesn't affect in any way the amount of time and effort we will spend on evaluating a service's strengths. So just, again, it's just important that pre-intelligence gathering, that there's reassurance and assurance from us that it is not about prejudging. It's about making sure our inspection activity is proportionate and targeted, so it's as least intrusive as possible for the service, the young people in it, and the leadership and staff teams. So the other component of pre-inspection planning is the inspector will look at the information we've received from young people, external professionals, and staff through their questionnaire returns and their responses. And then from all of this information, the inspector develops an inspection plan which frames where the possible care practices areas are to look at in terms of strengths and areas for improvement. So that's what the inspector's doing. What, I suppose, are the things in terms of pre-inspection preparation that the service can do? Well, as many of you already know, we send an email to the service prior to the inspection with links to electronic questionnaires for young people and staff. And this email also requests the contact details of external professionals, and it asks for those to be returned to us. What helps is making sure these links to electronic questionnaires are distributed early, and that folk, particularly children and young people, are encouraged to respond with, of course, independent support facilitated for children and young people to complete them if that's what's needed. It's also great if the external professional contact details are sent back to us as quickly as possible. And also, We don't feel that you're usurping the inspection process at all. If you encourage these professionals to provide early feedback, when they receive our response request, we totally and utterly appreciate it's their responsibility to provide this feedback, and you're not in control of that feedback, but don't feel you can't encourage them to do so if you feel they've got something valid and useful to say about your service. So all of these things then give the inspector a head start to their evidence gathering. It eases the triangulation demands of evidence gathering a bit, so eases the burden in the service when the inspector visits. And as Helen mentioned, secondly and crucially, have your core assurances evidence to hand. That eases the inspection process markedly. Or if your core assurance documentation and policies and forms are held solely on ICT, just making sure that the ICT systems permissions are readied if that's needed for inspectors to access them. Now, we expect the core assurances to be, as we call it, to hand, because they are the key practice frameworks for safe and good outcomes for children and young people. Most of them will either be being used every day or being referred to almost every day, or staff should be very familiar with them. And I'll touch on them in a bit more detail later on when we get to the fieldwork stage. Now, if you attended last year's webinar, you'll remember we shared the core assurances in the presentation, as I'm sure you'll remember that presentation that being 12 months ago. But the core assurances now, they're explicitly detailed in the new Key Question 7 framework document. So they're there for you to refer to. And that Key Question 7 framework document, that's Charlotte's put that on as a link, as you'll see, and it's also on the Care Inspectorate Hub. If you still aren't sure after reading the Key Question 7 framework and the core assurances what is meant by any of them, then speak to your case holding inspector. We're quite happy to have that dialogue so you know exactly what we define as core assurances, because we understand that's not what you call these documents in your day-to-day work in the service. But if you want to have a proactive discussion with your case holding inspector about what that means, it allows them that shared set of expectations when inspection comes along. And that's where I suppose in that context, I'd also strongly recommend you look at our recording of our launch webinar for the revised Key Question 7. It was a couple of weeks ago, and it goes into some further detail on the importance of core assurances. And we'll try and put that into the link in the chat as well, if we've got it. Linked again to that webinar, because it goes the webinar also goes through the new Key Question 7 in some detail, is it helps when leaders and teams have a good understanding of the quality framework and Key Question 7. So what that means is that I suppose what that means in essence is that if you have a good understanding of the quality framework and relevant Key Question 7s, then what we found is that shared understanding of the Key Question 7 facilitates a shared language and a shared set of expectations between services and ourselves before and during the inspection. And then what that does is it helps minimise potential misconceptions about evaluations, why particular evidence is being looked at. So again, there's the Key Question 7 documents there as well, and the webinar takes you through the Key Question 7 and also the changes between the Key Question 7 that's been implemented for the last couple of years and the new one that we're using from the 1st of April. And we'll also I think it's been put into the provider update, and if it's not, we'll get that into the next one along with a recording of this session. Also, finally, it's always useful to explain the process of inspection and the reasons for it to both young people and staff. We have posters that can be put up in the service for young people, and also a video that's available for our children and young people, which has been produced by our young inspection volunteers. And both of these links, I'm sure, are in the pre-inspection letter you receive. So make sure that you use all of those tools that are available within the pre-inspection letter. But I suppose this session is particularly for leaders and staff. And one of the great things you can do is reassure staff about that the inspection process itself is evaluating the provider's provision of the service. It's not an individual test of staff's knowledge and skills. We view staff as important witnesses and participants to the outcomes that young people are experiencing. And the ultimate responsibility for these outcomes lies with the provider, as it is their service which is registered with us. Now, of course, staff themselves clearly have their own professional responsibilities as individuals registered within the SSSC. But it's just to emphasise that job for staff and for managers and external managers is about reassuring staff that when we ask to interview staff, this is not about us coming in and trying to find fault and testing their knowledge and skills as individuals. So let's get on to now. Do we have? Yeah, we'll carry on. Let's get on to the fieldwork component of the inspection process. Reassure staff. I'm ahead of myself in terms of what I've just talked about. So, inspection fieldwork, the principles. Firstly, I suppose evaluations are chiefly based on outcomes for children and young people, but also, and that's important, they're also evaluations are also based on risks to outcomes. And this links to the importance of core assurances. As I just mentioned, evaluations are chiefly based on outcomes, but also importantly, risks to outcomes. And that's because our scrutiny and improvement agendas have to make sure good outcomes and safe care aren't happening by accident or good fortune, but are sustainable and designed in. So it's about ensuring young people's rights to be safe and have the best outcomes are consistent and embedded. And that's where the link to core assurances is key. And I suppose it also explains that apparent contradiction between the care inspectorate saying we focus chiefly on outcomes and the experiences of children and young people, but then we also spend time focusing on what looks like inputs and the dreaded paperwork. The reason for that is because theories and inquiries into when care goes wrong, including the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, which the care inspectorate was called to give evidence to, have highlighted the key practice areas that are important to monitor for safe care. So we now know what the key practice areas are to monitor, and we also know that quality inputs and processes are key drivers for good outcomes and minimising the risks to poor outcomes. And that's why we examine these core assurances at every inspection. But core assurances, it's a dry subject, ain't it? But I suppose it's also important, however, to stress that our focus is on the effectiveness of these key inputs and processes in delivering good outcomes. It's not just looking at inputs and processes and paperwork for the sake of it. So that's what we're doing. We're looking at the effectiveness of these in terms of safe and improving and good outcomes. There's a wee plus in capitals, and that's as well as the core assurances in children and young people services. We also ask to see 3 or 4 other. Is it 3 others? Yeah. The admission, we always ask at every inspection to see the matching and admissions policy and the processes around that. Staffing needs assessment, continuing care welfare assessments if they're relevant, or the continuing care and the continuing care policy, and the service training plan and records. So that also just gives you a wee bit about what we're doing. So what will I do? Will I carry on, or will I give people a break? No, what I'll do is, will we take a break now, Charlotte, and then I'll come back to it. If we say we take a break and come back to, what do you reckon, Charlotte? 3 o'clock, 5 to 3?
Yeah, just come back at 3, I think.
Come back at 3, perfect.
Yeah.
And I'll be checking how many people come back, because that no, I won't be. Right, thanks, and we'll see you all back at 3 o'clock. Cheers. Hi folks, welcome back. Charlotte, is it okay for me to just keep rolling on?
Yeah, just carry on, Andy. Thanks.
Perfect. Right. Okay. Thanks very much, guys, for coming back. We appreciate it. So the next, the start of the second half of this, I suppose the next thing that it's worthwhile to do is just 2 seconds on what the actual purpose of inspection fieldwork is, and it's about gathering and triangulating first-hand experience. After all that pre-inspection planning and intelligence gathering, it's about gathering and triangulating first-hand experience about young people's experiences and outcomes they're being supported to achieve. And triangulating evidence, as you might hear, that people and inspectors using that language, that's really just the process by which the inspector correlates or joins up the dots between the different pieces of evidence gathered to build up the evaluation. And anyone who's been or experienced an inspection will know we do that in three ways: talking to people, observation, and sampling documentation. And the size and the nature of that documentation sample is informed by the level and nature of the identified risks and any patterns or themes that might emerge. And I'll talk a wee bit more about that specifically later, but not too much, because I appreciate how dry that is. Also, it might be helpful to know that what we've generally found is that better performing services know their strengths and areas for improvement, and you won't get penalised for being open and transparent about these. Quite the opposite. So, and good self-evaluation is essential for that. And we've developed some self-evaluation tools for services this year to assist with doing this. And I think they're also on the hub. And Charlotte might have also provided the links to these as well. Now, the areas identified in a service's self-evaluation might still be taken into account in evaluations, both as strengths and also areas for improvement. Now, we sometimes get queried why that's the case. Not about strengths. People can see if they've detailed that it's a strength, we've triangulated the evidence, and we indeed find it's a strength. There's usually not very many queries about us adding that or using that as part of our evaluations. However, sometimes we get queries about when we've included something in our evaluations or an inspection report that the manager has acknowledged is a known area for improvement. And that's because sometimes that might still have an impact on outcomes or risks to outcomes. What's key here, however, is that the service's knowledge and management of areas for improvement that they've identified facilitates better and safer outcomes. And that's positive, and that's what you'll get credit for. A service, on the other hand, not knowing where it has to improve, however, increases the risk to consistently good and improving outcomes being achieved. So that's just that nuance there in terms of self-evaluation and its use within the inspection process. And finally, inspection is based on a partnership approach. It's impossible, when you are under scrutiny, which is what you are, to feel that or to feel that genuinely, because it is your scrutiny that's being assessed. but we are committed to taking a respectful and collaborative approach to our fieldwork, even and especially when, in fact, we're finding poor outcomes or a risk to safe outcomes. Helen is a very strong leader in terms of her expectations for this, and we adhere to it completely. As the national regulator, it's inherently right that we view services as partners in the journey to improve outcomes for children and young people. And part of that, as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, is being empathetic to the current pressures experienced by frontline staff and managers due to factors that may be beyond their control. The qualification, I suppose, to that is, though, that we always, however, have to be clear that our sole and key focus is safeguarding and improving outcomes for children and young people. And if we don't, there's a danger that what we do is disguise the reality of their cared for experiences and compromise their rights, because our evaluations place a greater emphasis on how services are managing the current pressures in the sector rather than the outcomes for them as children and young people. But as I say, we're equally clear that any difficult or challenging conversations we need to have or regulatory action we need to take will be done in a way that's open, transparent and direct. And that bit about being partners, it's just those little things within the fieldwork setting. We're not going to disrupt existing plans and fieldwork days. We'll always be mindful of young people's routines or other commitments. We'll always consider pausing the inspection if there are clear pressures that are seriously impacting on the manager. And we'll always share with the manager straight away if we have any concerns about young people's safety or well-being, to let them take any action that's needed. Now, I've just realised that actually sounds a bit Sermon on the Mount-ish, which is never a good thing. But hopefully that provides the context of how we want to treat an inspection and our relationships with everybody involved in that inspection process when we go out and visit the service. So let's cut to the chase. I hear you might actually get on about when there is a knock on the door and you discover it's not the postie but your inspector. So the process. There's a knock on the door. What happens? Well, the first thing to do is prepare you. There may actually be more than one person on your doorstep, and not to be concerned about that. There can be any number of reasons for this that have nothing to do with you as a service. It may be because our pre-inspection intelligence and planning indicates there's some potentially complex assessments to be made. So a second inspector is there to make sure the fieldwork doesn't drag on and make the process more elongated and stressful. But it may be equally be because of inductions for new inspectors, quality assurance, the size of the service, or that there's some specialist expertise another inspector has that will add value to the evaluations. It might also be that a young inspection volunteer is in attendance, and we'll hear more about that later. So I suppose what I'm saying is, don't read anything into that. And again, it's emphasising it's not a result of any prejudgments we have made in terms of the outcomes that we might find. Now, when we enter the service, the inspector will try and make sure that the first significant contact is with young people, if any of them are about, rather than meeting with the manager. Now, of course, the inspector will need to speak to the manager briefly to risk assess contact and communication with young people and get the lay of the land. But we want to make sure children and young people know that they are front and centre of our inspection. So the first individuals who are spoken to, it does send an important message as to whose views carry the most weight. So I suppose if the inspector walks into service and spends the first hour with the manager shut in their office and then comes out, I wouldn't blame young people for mistakenly thinking who the inspector wants the closest relationship with and whether they should trust them. So this first contact is important, and it might be as simple as asking any young people if they can give us a tour of their home, having a cup of tea, or just briefly making introductions and saying hello, and asking whether they'll be about for a chat later. Now, of course, if we pitch up and there are no young people about, as they're all in education, then we won't complain. But I suppose we're not going to ignore the fact that, of course, speaking to the manager is a key discussion. But that shouldn't be a one-off on the first morning. It'll be part of an ongoing dialogue throughout the visit. So during that initial brief meeting, the inspector will email a list of the core assurances to the manager and those other policies I mentioned earlier, just to make sure that they're as accessible as quickly as possible. But again, in that context, we appreciate there's existing meetings and other commitments the manager might have to prioritise that first morning. So, you know, we know it's not possible or helpful to drop everything in that respect. But hopefully there's a member of night staff that can help us, or a member of care staff that can help us to guide us to where some of that those core assurances are. And then, as you say, what we can't do is make any assumptions, or our policy and inspection guidance is very clear. We can't make any assumptions that core assurances are there. And that's sometimes when it leads to the inspector needing to unnecessarily have to clarify or confirm uncertainties or gaps. And that potentially adds to anxieties, as I've talked about, which is what we're trying to minimise. So we would generally expect, normally, all things being equal, for all the core assurances to be accessible by the end of the first day, and certainly by lunchtime on the second day of fieldwork. And you don't have to wait for it all to be available before you confirm this with inspector. Just provide the detail of its availability when it's possible. And I suppose top tip from us, usually the first core assurance inspectors, the first core assurances that inspectors will usually want to see are incident records. And that's just because there's a significant amount of triangulation that originates from these. So after that brief initial introduction with the manager and our informal chat with young people, the inspector will then meet with the manager or the most senior member of staff that's about and discuss the current state of play of the service, strengths, areas for improvement, and they'll also map out with the manager the best times to speak to young people, staff, and any other practicalities. And then they begin the process of speaking to young people, speaking to staff, observation and sampling documentation, as we talked about. In terms of speaking to young people, as you'd imagine, most important part of fieldwork, and we'll try and maximise the opportunities for this. In this respect, all our inspections should have an evening component and not be undertaken purely in office hours. And also our contact with young people doesn't need to be just about sitting down to, again, interview them. It might be talking to them through participating in an activity with them, sharing a meal, if that's what a young person feels more comfortable with. And Abbas, one of our young inspection volunteers, will speak about their role in this later in terms of speaking with young people. Now, as well as the manager, we'll speak to staff. We'll speak to a sample of permanent staff in a variety of roles, and also any agency staff working in the service at the time of the inspection, because that's important. And the final group of staff we'll speak to will be night staff. Again, that's because they often singleton work and are having to support young people in some of in extreme crisis sometimes. Again, I'm not going to go back, broken record. I appreciate that. We want to make staff feel as at ease and as comfortable as possible when being interviewed. We'll do our bit to try and help them understand that they're being talked to as important witnesses to the practice and outcomes at the service, and again, it's not a test of their knowledge and trying to catch them out. So we don't see them as a representative of the provider, but as people with direct knowledge and valuable insight into the experiences and outcomes for children and young people. Now, inspectors will use a staff interview template that details the broad practice areas that need to be covered, but there are also 3 mandatory safeguarding questions that every staff member must be asked, covering the reporting of concerns and whistleblowing. Now, again, these aren't trick questions or because we have concerns about this individual service, but they're asked at every service inspection because they are so pivotal in terms of children and young people's safety. Again, another part of our triangulation is observation, and that can be difficult in a small care home, without a doubt. It either feels like a Big Brother challenge or a goldfish bowl. And again, that's why the evening component of inspections is important, as it can give great opportunities for young people being together or out in activities or sharing a meal. And also, the manager's also likely to be absent. Again, that's not about catching people out, but we really want to pick up evidence of the culture and relationships within the care home service 24/7, and the manager clearly isn't there 24/7. Again, I've also talked about sampling of documentation, code assurances. That's it. Not going to revisit it. I think, well, you'll certainly appreciate we've laboured that. And now revisiting informal feedback. Now, what I spoke about earlier was our aim to inspect in partnership with services. Okay, so if there's any specific issues we pick up in the process of any of these activities that I've just described, the inspectors will share, clarify them with you as managers or senior staff as we go along. And this also importantly goes for strength. We want the feedback throughout an inspection to be balanced. If the manager's about at the end of each inspection day, the inspector will give some brief general feedback on their observations, again referencing strengths and possible areas for further examination, clarification if there's any uncertainties. And the aim of this is to try and ensure there is few surprises as possible at the formal feedback in terms of the evidence that we've gathered or our findings. And again, in that spirit of partnership, if the manager's leaving before the inspector finishes, then feel free to ask for some feedback. Inspector will try and accommodate that, unless, of course, there's a more pressing scrutiny activity that needs to take place. For example, an interview with a young person that won't be about again, or a member of staff who's leaving shift. But we'll try and be as flexible as we can to make sure that informal feedback and dialogue happens throughout the inspection. And equally, if you're not clear about any of the ongoing feedback, then feel free to get some clarification so you can be fully cited on it. As we appreciate, while we're trying to work towards a shared language and shared expectations, that's not always the case. So feel free to ask questions and get that as clear as possible for you throughout the inspection. Again, that doesn't guarantee there will be agreement, but it increases that chance of a shared understanding of the direction of evaluations come the end of the inspection. And then we get to formal feedback itself. Now, we may do that in person at the end of the last day of fieldwork, but the last day of fieldwork is also, unless there are exceptional circumstances, the last day we would normally accept and review evidence, other than that of any external professionals we may need to speak to. And if feedback isn't done at the end of the last day of fieldwork, it'll be held virtually over Teams, and that date will be agreed early on in the inspection. We'd also encourage the external manager to attend, as we've found that that's really beneficial in terms of the ongoing improvement journey of the service and the exploration of the messages of feedback. But we can't, unfortunately, delay feedback to ensure this happens, because inspectors are on an extremely tight schedule in terms of their inspection plan. What can I say about formal feedback? Well, it's supposed to be interactive, and it follows the same principles of partnership working as the rest of the inspection process. So ask questions, seek clarity if you feel you don't understand any aspects of it. I mean, we really are aiming for a position that the feedback shouldn't offer any big surprises in terms of evidence, as any specific or material issues will have been discussed with the manager on an ongoing basis. One of the changes, and again, it's what Helen alluded to, and again, about just that acknowledgement about the pressures on frontline managers and staff at the moment, will also make sure that feedback acknowledges when it's evident that managers and staff are working hard in difficult circumstances. We will acknowledge that, or we'll acknowledge perhaps when they're having a positive impact in successfully mitigating challenging circumstances. And we'll also try, when it's appropriate, to frame our areas for improvement and requirements to where the appropriate responsibility lies for that in terms of providers or external managers, as well as the management teams and staff. Again, that's not detracting that our evaluations will be solely focused on the outcomes and risked outcomes for children and young people, but our feedback will certainly acknowledge the efforts in terms of staff and managers working in that care service, dealing with matters that might be out with their control. Now, some aspects that we've found help leaders get the most out of feedback: understanding the quality framework, particularly key question 7, it really helps. And again, that's because the structure of feedback will follow the key questions, the quality indicators, the key areas, and the quality illustrations within the quality framework. So because it follows that sequence, if folk have a knowledge of it, it begins to help them visualize the assessment that is being given by the inspector. And also a knowledge of the grading criteria also helps. Now, the narrative attached to each grade in the grading criteria is what the inspector matches their evaluations to. So again, if you know the grading criteria in advance, then the feedback is more likely to be accessible and therefore more valuable. And I suppose just in relation to grading, it's not really about inspection process, but it's probably useful to emphasise. We have been asked whether the revised key question 7 will have a blanket material impact for all services and grades. We don't believe so. From our knowledge of services, the vast majority which are achieving a grade of very good are meeting the outcomes described in the revised key question 7 illustrations. That doesn't mean, however, that evaluations may not be impacted for some specific services, as there is a stronger focus has been placed on certain outcomes and also those aspects of practice which can minimise the risks to these outcomes. So again, I would recommend matching your own internal self-evaluation processes against the revised quality illustrations in key question 7. And finally, be aware, I suppose it's just helpful, especially for external managers, to know that using the same inputs and processes, policies and procedures or paperwork in different services won't necessarily equate to the same outcomes or risks to outcomes across these services. And that's because there's lots of variables in play that affect whether a policy or process is implemented effectively to produce good outcomes. So, for example, the culture in which inputs are used, how well staff are led, staff competence and experience, their confidence in using policies and procedures, and how well they're quality assured. So again, just because the same policies and procedures are being used across a whole range of services doesn't mean that has the same impact on outcomes and experiences for children and young people. And the final thing, I suppose, just to be aware in terms of grading and evaluations, is that our evaluations and inspections, as I've said, broken record again, they are based chiefly on outcomes, although we also factor in risked outcomes. The third component is that these evaluations are also dynamic. And that's particularly important when you're faced with that disappointing news that evaluations are lower than at the previous inspection, you know, and that is that can be soul destroying to hear. What we sometimes hear in feedback is we are doing exactly the same as we did last year. We've improved some aspects, so we're not quite clear why our grades are lower. And the reason for this is similar to the principle of the same policies in different services don't necessarily result in the same outcomes. And that is that there are lots of dynamic variables that can impact outcomes and the risks to outcomes. The changes of young people or their needs and changes to staffing are both hugely significant. If a service is doing exactly the same, for example, as they were previously with such changes, there's a risk that those outcomes may not be the same. And that's because the changes to young people or their needs or staffing usually require a range of proactive and at times really significant leadership interventions to keep outcomes stable. So the reality is that to maintain the status quo of outcomes, and therefore grades, it usually requires powerfully effective responses to change. And I know that certainly ain't news to this audience, but we know that that change is a constant and inevitable fixture within every care home and residential school setting, which is why those evaluations from inspection to inspection can be so dynamic. So in other words, we don't downgrade services, which is a term we occasionally hear. Every inspection, we undertake a fresh assessment of outcomes and risks to outcomes since the last inspection. And this constant need to proactively and positively manage change is why a grade, I suppose, of very good is difficult to maintain, and evaluations of excellent are really difficult to maintain. So, post-inspection, we are on the home stretch. You will be very, very, very glad to hear, and I will try and get finished by 3:30, which is my finishing time. What happens post-inspection? Well, first of all, there's report. In terms of the production of the inspection report, you should expect to receive this within 15 days of receiving the formal feedback. And how we write reports and the narrative of reports follows the same principles for how we provide feedback in terms of its content and about acknowledging in that narrative the hard work and the effort that if staff are really doing their best in difficult circumstances to meet the needs of children and young people, we will reflect that in the narrative of the inspection report, because we acknowledge how important that is. And we will also, in terms of the report, as we would with feedback, make sure that areas for improvement and requirements are framed to where the responsibility lies. The error response, well, services then have 10 days to submit an error response through e-forms, and if we don't receive an error response, then the report will be finalised and placed on the web. Production and sorry, I feel I'm speaking very fast, but I'm sure you're not disappointed by that. Production and implementation of the action plan. If there are any areas for improvement or requirements identified at the inspection, we then expect providers to submit an action plan. And that again is done through e-forms. The inspector will then review it, and if they assess it's robust enough, that will be taken into account in the review of the scrutiny assessment tool that happens after every inspection. If we feel the action plan needs a bit more work to adequately address the areas for improvement or requirements, then we'll return it to you and ask for some more detail. And of course, your inspector is more than happy to chat through and clarify expectations if either side isn't clear about the content of the action plan and what's needed. And finally, we appreciate the impact of having that report placed publicly on the website. So we appreciate the power and impact that our final and public evaluations have on leaders and staff, and we take that impact seriously. So again, whilst our focus is rightly on the young people being cared for, hopefully this past hour or so will have shed some light on our approach and processes and assisted in making our independent scrutiny more transparent and understood, and therefore a bit less anxiety-provoking. Many, many thanks for listening and bearing with me, and I think it's my job now to hand over to Alison.
Thanks, Andy. So I'm going to talk to you about our focus area for this year. And this isn't something new. You probably know that we've had focus areas in the past, for example, around safer recruitment and CSE. And this year we're doing a focus area for continuing care, and I'll give you some background as to why that is. So continuing care is our focus area for this year. And just a bit of context to that, we have worked quite hard with the sector over a period of time to improve the understanding of children's rights to continuing care. And this is just a little reminder of some of the things that we have done to help with that. Some of these are a bit outdated now, so apologies, because you probably know what we've done. So firstly, we changed how we put conditions on registration certificates. So we took the upper age limit of certificates in terms of care homes for young people, because what we were finding was when young people wanted to remain where they were in placement, providers and services needed to seek a variation to change that age. Most certificates now, I think, don't have an upper age limit on them, but if you still have a certificate that has that, it's quite easy just to go into the portal and ask for that to be removed. And that means when young people reach the age of 18, they seamlessly continue in your service and you don't need to let us know about it. We also asked fostering agencies to register an adult placement service, because fostering legislation, as you might know, fostering only is up to the age of 18, so we needed to help fostering agencies make sure that children could remain with their foster carers. So that's why we did that. And we updated our admissions guidance so that providers can consider the longer term needs of young people, because we understand the impact of placement disruption and the benefits for children when they're living in a secure, nurturing placement for as long as that meets their needs. And we worked with Celsius and Clan Child Law in 2021 to help the sector understand its responsibilities around welfare assessments and continuing care. And from that, we jointly developed some resources to support young people's right to continuing care. And as Andy's been discussing around key question 7, we've actually strengthened what we look at in inspection around continuing care and how you're enabling that to take place. Right, so just going back to the work that we did with Celsius and Clan Child Law, that was a really significant piece of work that we did in 2021 to promote the legislation and guidance and highlight responsibilities for ensuring children's right to continuing care. And we produced a webinar in relation to that, which is still available, and I think we have it ready to put in the chat. And if you haven't seen that webinar, I would really encourage you to have a look at it, because it's a really helpful reminder, particularly from Kenny McGee, who did an input. He was working at Celsius at the time, and he did an input on the the research around the importance of ensuring good outcomes for care experienced young people and the importance of children remaining in secure placements in order for them to achieve those outcomes. And I think that's quite powerful when you look at the evidence around that. And Julia Donnelly from Clan Child Law explains very ably the legislation around welfare assessments. So have a look at that if you haven't had it already. I know that some people do use that in training, and it's been really helpful in terms of new managers coming into services and just in terms of our expectations. So you'll want to know what we are looking for in this focus area. So here's what it's giving you a heads up to have this ready for us and to do an assessment, I suppose, before we come in as to how far you are in meeting what our expectations are for young people now and what the expectations of what all providers are doing. So the focus area will concentrate on do you have a continuing care policy? So that's straightforward. We're looking at that, we're looking at the quality of that, and that should be in place. Does the service ensure that placing authorities understand the service's commitment to continuing care? So that's really for the voluntary and independent providers, because the responsibility for continuing care and the responsibility for ensuring that welfare assessments are in place lies with local authorities. But as a provider, you have a commitment really to ensure that young people's rights are being addressed. And so we would be looking to see that you have an understanding that you're wanting to provide that long-term care for children if it's appropriate for them. Is it clear in placement agreements with local authorities? So again, I think it's very helpful if providers working with local authorities are clear about that commitment and that is that's detailed in a placement agreement, and that will support young people to remain. And are young people aware of their rights to continuing care within a reasonable and appropriate timescale after starting to use the service? So when we worked with Clan Child Law and Celsius, we jointly produced some resources to enable services to inform young people of their right to continuing care. So there's a video, and we also distributed packs of postcards, you might remember, to services. And we were hoping that you would share those with young people, because they give examples of different placement types where young people, explaining the right to continuing care within those different settings. We're not able to reproduce those cards, unfortunately, because it was a set piece of money we had to produce that resource. But hopefully, if you've still got those in your service, you can still use those with young people. If you don't, access the video that we've done and find different ways. So we'll be looking at what are you doing to inform young people? Do you have your own resources or your own ways to make sure that children understand what they're entitled to? And has a welfare assessment been carried out for young people? And I say timorously because that really should not be when a young person reaches the age of 16. And I think what we were talking about in our previous webinar was, by the time young people reach the age of 16, if you're just starting to introduce the idea that they can remain in the service, other things might be happening in their life that distract from that thinking. So I think it's really important that young people know much earlier than that this placement can continue if it's in their interests and if they want to do that, and to start having a discussion around that. And again, when the provider isn't a local authority, have they made it clear to the local authority that there's an expectation that they will that welfare assessments need to be done. Because I think we hear sometimes from services that where we're not seeing welfare assessments in place, is that responsibility, which is true, lies with the local authority. But actually, we're looking for evidence that you've actually advocated for young people so that those are done, or that, you know, young people might get external advocacy if there's a need for that to be done. So we'll be looking to see how you manage that. We're looking for examples of good practice in services, because at the end of this focus area, we will be producing a report which hopefully will give an indication of how well the service is performing and what the impact has been of the work we have done with services to improve continuing care expectations and young people receiving continuing care. So we're looking for good examples. So if you have those, please have them ready for us. We might want to use some of those in the report to demonstrate good practice and how that comes about. And I think, because we did this in the CSC report, we also gave examples of poorer practice, and that's really so that the sector can understand maybe where things are going wrong and the impact for young people when things go wrong. So we'll be looking to see, examples around those two things, so that we can reflect on that in our report and try to help the service to improve. And we will also be asking how many young people are in continuing care, and that will give us a good understanding of the effectiveness of what you're doing in order to enable and support young people to remain. And that's really what we're going to be doing in our next inspection year, well, our current inspection year, and we've already started that process. So we've already completed a few focus areas in that, and we're starting to collate the information around it. So I'm now going to pass you to Mary Morris, who's going to lead on our discussion around participation. So Mary, I'll just hand you over and turn my camera off.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks, Alison and Andy. Lots of information there from my colleagues about, you know, how the process, what we do, and what we're asking you to do. You'll have seen in the revised key question 7 a big emphasis shift in terms of, you know, the promise 2030 looming, and you know how all of us are keeping those commitments and that aspirational agenda. But it's not, you know, it's not like you are the only ones who are involved in that, and we recognise and understand there's a lot of work for us as the care inspectorate in terms of what we need to do, and you know, there was a lot in the independent care review of asks on us. So we various kind of work streams around that. So we're just going to give you a little bits of tasters today from our work stream 2, which is around participation. So firstly, we're going to hear from Lisa. So one of our aims is that children's voices can be heard clearly in what we do, and when and where we do it, and how we report it. So, you know, we're not there yet, we've quite a way to go, but Lisa, one of our inspectors, is going to talk to us a bit about that. And then very excitingly, and for me, probably the highlight of the afternoon, we're going to hear from one of our fantastic young inspection volunteers, Abbas, who we're incredibly lucky to have working with us as part of the Care Inspectorate team, Care Inspectorate family. He's going to tell you a little bit about himself and the work, and they've just been doing some filmmaking training, so they're going to hot off the press share a wee film with us, and then I'm going to talk us through some of our promise in practice articles. But first of all, I'll introduce Lisa Fagan, and Lisa's going to tell you a little bit of some of the work she's been involved in. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Mary. Good afternoon, everyone. So, as Mary has said, there has been a children and young people's feedback project which has been developed, and the project aim was to develop and implement a feedback process that directly involved children and young people. And the background and rationale of this project, as Mary says, was to embed the UNCRC, the promise, and also the Care Inspectorate's commitment to prioritise participation. And so the promise recommended that the Care Inspectorate reviewed its frameworks and methodology to ensure that inspections focus on areas that matter to children, young people and their families. So we have reviewed our methodology specifically in relation to how we provide feedback to children and young people post-inspection. The Children and Young People's Feedback Project Team was formed in August of last year, and the project team has included input from our Senior Methodology Advisor, our Senior Improvement Advisor, and also 3 inspectors from the Children and Young People's team. The project team has had responsibility for the delivery of upscale testing, which has included testing the different feedback methods, as well as monitoring the impacts and outcomes of these tests. The project has an oversight group, which has included input from our Children and Young People's Team Service Manager, our Quality and Improvement Support Service Manager, and our Young Inspection Volunteer. The Oversight Group has had strategic responsibility for the project, including authorising processes and the next steps. We have slowly rolled this out through an initial pilot, devising processes, guidance and exploring different feedback approaches. The feedback approaches have been varied. They have included in-person feedback to children and young people, feedback using a video method, as well as feedback posters addressed to all the children and young people. The pilot has also considered a range of factors, such as children and young people's preferences, the service location, as well as assessing what would work best on a case-by-case basis. The purpose of the feedback is to firstly thank children and young people for their involvement and also welcoming us during inspections. The feedback also aims to capture children and young people's views and how their views may have supported our evaluations. The feedback may also summarise if improvements are identified, such as areas for improvement or requirements. So we have an example of an anonymised completed poster, which we can share on the next slide, please, Charlotte. Thank you. So we can see from this poster that it has 3 main sections: what is going well, what could be better, and what is next. In this example, the first 2 sections have summarised the key findings during the inspection process, and the what's next has included any requirements or areas for improvement identified. At the end of the poster, we have included the individual inspector's name and contact details. For some posters, we have also linked in with our translations team to have posters translated where appropriate for children and young people. So we can see an example of an anonymised translated poster here. The project team have also sought feedback via surveys from services who have been involved in this pilot, and the feedback so far from the services overall has been positive. However, it's acknowledged that this will be a process which is ongoing, dynamic, and one which will be gradually rolled out. Thank you for listening, and I'll pass you back to Mary. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Just a wee taste there of some of the work that we're doing. Abbas, are you okay to tell us a wee bit about yourself and your role as one of our Young Inspection volunteers? There you are. I see you. Brilliant.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Welcome, Abbas. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Mary. Yeah, and I'm Abbas Conte, a young inspector volunteer, and I'm currently studying ISO in City of Glasgow College.
Yeah, no worries. I've been in Scotland for almost 3 years now. November, I'm going to be 3 years, and I'm studying ETOL at City of Glasgow College, and I like playing football, and I'm an Arsenal fan, which, yeah, it's not the best weekend, but still we've got hopes. And yeah, so I heard about the Care Inspectorate from Guardianship and a group called YVP, which I'm also part of. And essentially what we do there is we speak to young unaccompanied asylum seekers like myself, and we talk about the rights and advocate about some of the things which are important to them. And also, we've been through many other programs. For example, for about 2 or 3 months ago, young asylum seekers, unaccompanied young asylum seekers, were not allowed to study full time till they get their status from the Home Office, till they get their residential status. And so we advocated, we went to the Scottish Parliament, we were invited, and also we spoke with the Minister for Young People, and that has been changed now, so young people can study, irrespectively if they've not gotten younger unaccompanied asylum seekers can study full time, even if they've not gotten their refugee status. Yeah, so that's kind of the thing we do at YVP, and I heard about the young inspector role from that group where the care inspector went there and spoke to us. I was actually in, and they spoke to a couple of my friends, and they told me after, and some of them they don't have the chance because they've gotten their status at that time, and I had the chance, and I'm like, yes, a good role, and it's kind of similar what we do to YVP, and I decided to join because I wanted to make a change for young people, can experience as myself, and I've seen as a change to improve not only young unaccompanied asylum seekers, but also young people that have been through or are in the care system. And yeah, so, and it is important for young inspector volunteers to have care experience, because I think when you go to inspections, you tend to resonate with what young people say and what they do, and they feel comfortable sharing their experiences or how they're living in their accommodation. And yeah, so what we do when we go to inspections, first of all, we have a pre-meeting with the senior inspectors, and we are told about what the space or the homes these young people they're living, and brief details about them, not too much, their names and what they do for fun and how long they've been in these accommodations. So we have like a pre-plan a meeting before we go to inspections. And when we get there, I tried as much as possible to make the space safe for young people so they can be able to share about the experiences there and what they love doing and some of the problems they might be facing. And for most of the cases, yeah, when we go there, young people feel comfortable sharing about their experiences living in these accommodations. And most of the feedbacks we've gotten from young people or speaking to them has been positive so far, because I've been through like 3 inspections so far, and yeah, which is good to know. And also, I tend to use my inspector instinct or my inspector skills to look around these homes and the accommodations to see how, if these if the necessary conditions have been met for young people, wherein it's a safe space for them, wherein they can have fun and things that it's their right. Because some young people, especially young people coming from different countries, don't know about all of their rights. So we try to make them comfortable telling us how they're living there. And I've also been involved with different events, a residential child residential with each and every child. Last year, I think, at Stalin, where we spoke about language, about the use of language, and what's the appropriate language to speak to young people or youth in that community. And also wherein young people share their experience, living in care experience. And also, as Mary already mentioned, media accredited training, which we did with Julie and other young inspectors and volunteers. Yeah, and it was very educative. We learned so much about camera stuff, how to use camera, how to do interviews, about ethics and confidentiality, which is very important.
Thank you. And I think you'll agree with me. I mean, is there a cooler bunch of young people than Abbas, Sean, Rosa, and Shannon? How insightful and how lucky are we to have them as part of our team? They're incredible, and we really, really are grateful, and we value them. And that's part of our work stream on the promise, that we demonstrate that we genuinely value the care experience young people who work with us. It's quite difficult to follow that, and to follow Abbas, who you know, is such an inspiring young man, and even though he's an Arsenal supporter, I'll let him off. So I'm just going to finish off just by highlighting something that we've been doing, the Promise in Practice features in Care News. And the reason we wanted to do this, again, all my colleagues have spoken about recognising, you know, it's a difficult time at the moment in the sector. We've heard about some of the pressures, but we also want to hear about, despite all that, there's some fantastic work going on and some massive success stories. So that was kind of the thinking behind why we wanted to make sure that we're highlighting that good news stories. Abbas spoke about spreading the good news in the wee film, and we want to do that and use our platform to do that. So our online I've lost the word. Our online newsletter for Care News. It's about almost 36,000 folks subscribe to it, so it's quite a big reach. So it's a good platform for us to share some features about good practice. And our thinking is that there's many services in Scotland where people are working hard to ensure that the promise is kept, and we want to share some of that, highlight and celebrate good practice. And we think it's, you know, it's good for individual services to get that opportunity, to get a bit of a shout out. But we also hope that it inspires and encourages and motivates and enhances morale, because, you know, sometimes the headlines and the stories that are picked out are not the good news stories, so that people can see, yeah, there's some great work going on. Or if it's the first one that we started with was a really inspiring young person, Corey, who wanted to tell and share his journey, and we kicked off with that, which was a great good news story, and people can see that, and hopefully that resonates and motivates and enhances morale across the sector. This won't be unfamiliar to you, and what we try and do is weave aspects of the 5 foundations across the Promise in Practice articles. It might be very clearly it's to do with some of the work that folk do to support connection with family, some of the great work that goes on in terms of brothers and sisters. We know that's happening in a lot of services. or it might be about enduring relationships, family-like relationships. The current feature in Care News is from Crawford Street, and that's, if you haven't read that, I would really encourage you to read that. And that's very much the words from Wendy and from folk working in the service. We've just done a little bit of editing in the introduction, but that's them saying what they do and how they do it, and celebrating, you know, work that's happening to keep the promise. And there'll be other things that we're keen to feature: young people's voice, some of the scaffolding, some of the great work to enhance understanding, training, some of the work that's happening. We know it's a big feature in terms of reducing restraint and restrictive practices. So there'll be lots of examples. So we might, when our inspectors are in services, we might ask you if that's something you'd consider doing with us. We can't highlight all the examples of good practice, but we want to use this as a means to share that practice where we see it and where we can. And it, you know, there might be other things that we look to do to highlight good practice and build on this, but we just think this is a you know, we've got a wee platform here, so we want to build on it. So and it might not be that your service, we might not be evaluating your service as perhaps being 100% brilliant in all aspects of it, but despite that, there might be some things that you're doing that are really, really exciting and inspirational, and we might ask you whether you'd consider being included in an article for us. We know there are sometimes issues in terms of confidentiality, so we would work with you. And as I say, if you look at the current Care News article, you'll see it's very much the words from the service, and a fantastic photograph actually as well. So I'll finish up. I wanted to thank you all very, very much for listening. Again, a really big thank you to Abbas. A couple of little technical glitches, but I think you'll agree with me, it was worth hearing from Abbas and seeing the wee film. But as well as thanking you for listening, we just wanted to thank you all as well for the work that you do day in and day out. We've got this slide with the heart eyes. We do see it. We do want you to know that it's recognised. We know there's a huge amount of commitment and passion for our children in Scotland. So thank you very, very much. I think Charlotte's going to come in now.
Thanks, Mary. So we've got a little survey for people if they want to give us any feedback on the webinar this afternoon. I'm just going to put the link to that in the chat just now. It'll only take you a couple of minutes. It's just if there's anything that we could improve on for next time, we'd be interested to hear that feedback. I'm not seeing any outstanding questions in the chat at the moment. If you do have any questions from anything you've heard this afternoon, please do just pop them in the chat, and I'll either pick them up just now or we can follow them up after the session today. I want to say a big thank you to all our speakers this afternoon. As Mary said, we've had a couple of technical issues, but you know, we've made it through. So thanks to Helen who opened for us this afternoon, Debbie from our registration team, Andy who provided the methodology input, Alison who delivered the input on continuing care, Lisa who spoke about the Young People's Participation Project, of course Abbas, the star of this afternoon, and Mary who's delivered the input on our promise and practice work. I hope that you found this session useful. We hope that, you know, being transparent with the sector about what our expectations are is something that services can use, and that you're able to take away something useful from this afternoon. We have recorded the session this afternoon, and we'll be making that recording available in the next couple of weeks. It'll be posted on our website, and we'll share the link to that through the provider update. So if there's anything you think you've missed, anything you want to go back and watch again or share with other people in your organisation, then obviously you'll be able to do that. So I'm still not seeing any questions in the chat, so I'm going to finish up there and give you back 13 minutes of your afternoon. Thanks everyone for joining us.